Hello, welcome to Varn Blog Solo, and today I'm going to be talking about Christopher Lasch, who I find myself talking about a lot since I started a book project 2 years ago with Shallon Von Tyne. A book project that may take me another 2 to 3 years to finish, if only so Shallon can finish her own dissertation. Now, Shallon and I are both fans of Christopher Lasch, and we began to talk about him many, many years ago in the complications of the way he was being used in 2015 and 16 to explain the Trump phenomenon and Steve Bannon's love of the revolt of the elites. I have been a fan of Christopher Lasch from when I was a conservative. And while I've talked about that, I'm not going to focus so much on that right now. My reading of Lasch as a conservative was not a particularly good one. And it was based on a couple of things. I have always balked at leftists and liberals, and this is mostly a liberal phenomenon, I will admit, that have asserted that there was a right side of history and a wrong side of history. And in fact, one of Lasch's students was recently on Know Your Enemy podcast and discussed Lasch's dislike of the same term. Now, one thing I will say, and I'm going to include the link to that particular episode in the show notes. But one thing I'm going to say about that is that Chris Lehman is right that the right and wrong side of history implies a generalized theological view of progress. Now, I have all sorts of flashes that come on when we talk about generalized teleological views of process. Teleology, by the way, is an Aristotelian concept that was folded into a lot of Christian philosophy, as well as Arabic philosophy and Neoplatonist philosophy. And the teleology is the development of something towards what it is made for. And of course, in Aristotelian thought, the development of something towards what it was made for is because what is unique to that thing, that type, is what it's made for. And this philosophy runs through European philosophy as a general assumption all the way into the 18th century. It's influential in Hegel. It is the tension between the apocalyptic and the teleological notions in Christian philosophy that lead Christianity to have both a progressive and anti-progressive worldview at the same time. Now, I think teleology is a useful concept, but the postmodernist and this is important, analytic philosophies both throw it out. And for some good reason, because general teleology sneaks in more than it explains. Now, when we talk about the teleology of a system, a system is designed to do a thing, or it is klug together to do a thing. For those of you who don't know what a klug is, it is anytime something develops kind of ad hoc with bits and pieces added on. These things have a teleology because these systems existed for something. But progress in general and applied to history or human development is, to me, from an analytical perspective, a category error, and from a Marxist perspective, a misunderstanding of history, contingency, and necessity. Now, when Chris Lehman went to talk to Sam Adler-Bell and Matt Stillman about Lasch, they focus more on the progress in his careers in The True and Only Heaven. The True and Only Heaven is one of my favorite late Lasch books, but it's also the book that problematizes Lasch. All right. The Culture of Narcissism is both the most famous and the most useful, but it has many problems. Social narcissism, as Lasch is using it, comes directly out of Freudianism and doesn't really map onto either the psychoanalytic or the cognitive psychiatry and psychology notions of what narcissism is. right? Lasch's use of social narcissism is that these personality traits are actually incentivized by the structure of our political economy. Now, Lasch's political economy, I would say, was largely based in the work of Paul Sweezy, and he is noting in Culture of Narcissism the shift from the factory disciplinary mode, which really defines the late 19th and early 20th century, into the Fordist corporate mode of the 30s through the 60s. But the hour of Minerva, as Hegel says, flies at dawn, and we see these things in hindsight. We often read the Culture of Narcissism as explaining the neoliberal period, and many of the traits of the corporate Fordist traits go into the neoliberal period despite the change in the economy. So we think about the social compact of the workers, but the officization of office work in the beginning of brands actually starts in the 40s and 50s. The shift is not fully instantiated until the financialization of the economy and the profitability crisis. And remember that Paul Sweezy in the 1970s, and this is what was defining a lot of Lasch's political economy, and he says so explicitly in Culture of Narcissism, by the way. He doesn't cite Sweezy, but he talks about monopoly capital. He may also have been pulling from Friedrich Pollock of the Frankfurt School. I have not gone through the footnotes exactly and noted where he got it from, or if he even says it in the book. I'm actually doing that work right now and working with Shalin. But by the time he writes True and Only Heaven, he has already noted the shift towards neoliberalism. And the shift towards neoliberalism for Lasch is a bipartisan affair, broadly handled by the liberal left, are the children of the progressives, and neoconservatism. He might have seen this shift going all the way back to the Congress of Cultural Freedom and the beginning of different Marxist groups to sell out. So narcissism and the party schema that he comes up with in Culture of Narcissism, the party of the id, the ego, and the superego, are helpful for understanding elements of what he's talking about. But the social conditions that Lasch is talking about have fundamentally shifted and actually been exacerbated from the Fordist period into now. And now that we see neoliberalism seeming to wind down while capital still churns on its MCM circuit, all right, our MCM prime circuit, we continue on. So progress in this context can only mean the assumption that the progress of capitalism must be communism. And yet we come up with theory after theory to explain the regression from that fact. Well, I have a little analytic, I have like an analytic philosopher and a psychoanalyst fighting in my brain at all times. You know, there are two sides of a debate in my head. And then I'm going to talk a little bit with anecdotes and data to explain why this may matter. But progress for me and the wrong side of history was always putting the cart before the horse. There is no right side of history. There is no art towards justice. There's the world we make based off the limitations of our being, running into the world that has already been made and what other people are fighting for. Progress is always domain specific. Now, whether or not you get this from a corporate idea like setting SMART goals, clear delimited goals where everything's stated, you have criterion of success, etc., and as obnoxiously corporate as that is, it's actually a useful practice, or whether you get it from the residue of logical positivism and throwing out ideas that do not have clear cognitive meaning, like generic progress refers to what is delimited by what and for what. All right. Progress has to be domain specific. Progress towards what, in accordance to what, how do you measure it, and what does it mean? What Lasch points to is the alliance with progressivism and certain kinds of Marxism with the idea of progress has made both terribly lazy and unable to deal with the reality of other people's lives. Everything must conform to us, must validate us, must tell us who we are. Now, yes, this is obvious in left-wing identitarian politics, but that's not even the worst of it. Think about how the conservative ethos is often to try to even eliminate or remove everything that is not it. Right? That is not a pre-modern conservative worldview. That is not even the worldview of de Maistre. But that is the narcissism of Ron DeSantis. No. What Lasch tells us that is interesting and truly interesting, and Chris Lehman does get into this, as does Kevin Mattson, who is Shallon's advisor and another student of Lasch. I think he may even knew Chris Lehman. I don't know Chris Lehman. I probably shouldn't refer to him by his first name. Is crucial for understanding some things. I've talked about this in terms of complexity theory before. Progress accumulates complexity. Complexity as just a physics system, right, requires more and more energy. There's more and more points for loss of energy. There's more and more points for breakdown and cascade failure. So that is a breakdown that causes other breakdowns down the line. Centralization also increases this. It seems to increase efficiency at first, but then you have diminishing returns on that efficiency. And then eventually you start having massive amounts of energy sink. Systems are complex. Human systems are super complex, and we are only making them more and more complex by globalization. You see this in ecology, and it is why the ecological thinkers have been more helpful here than the economic thinkers, even though they both think in systems. One of the basic assumptions of neoclassical economics is to bracket out things that do not fit your model and to stay in abstractions versus dealing with the sensuous. Marxists do this too. In fact, I recently did a solo video where I talked about the sensuous, and some people talked about how they went to the abstraction to fix their lives, but also to escape it. And this is a natural thing. I also do it. The world of abstract ideas removes you from the sensual consequences. But it's the sensual consequences, the particularities of things, the fine-grained differences that actually define how you build up collective agents. Otherwise, you're just dealing with aggregates and hypothesized structures of which you give agency. No. I think it is our assumption, and this is one I get from Lasch, that complexity and progress are tied together, but also at odds. Lehman points out that most of the people who supported Hillary Clinton were optimistic and were doing well, and the pessimistic people rejected her. Now, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about all kinds of things, and this was the last 3 years of people feeling rejected as if their personal selves were rejected, and the rejection of a particular different person who represented a particular different kind of elite, someone who came from an elite background, moved to Arkansas, moved to New York, became a senator, became a hub of politics, and has played both sides of this divide. You know, her populist campaign in 2008, which even had racialist undertones, versus her racialist shaming in 2016. Hillary Clinton is a particular figure. Now, the sexism is probably real, in fact, almost undoubtedly real. But to see yourself reflected in Hillary Clinton is to not realize that you and Hillary Clinton are not the same person. And this led to this debate about why the working class wasn't the subject. So we came up and resurrected the idea of PMC, this John and Barbara Ehrenreich concept from the 1970s, around the same time that Lasch wrote The Culture of Narcissism, actually. But we live in a different political economy than that. People have tried to resurrect James Burnham, and James Burnham was a former Trotskyist who became a founding member of the OSS. Wrote a book called The Modern Machiavellians, or now originally was entitled The Machiavellians, which is basically a soft defense of Italian fascist thinkers. But when he was talking about the managerials, he was not talking about college-educated people, credentialization throughout the society. That was not the world he lived in. He was talking about the beginnings of Fordism in a military management state, in a corporate management state. The structuralization of capital, so you couldn't talk about owners, but you could talk about the rich. But that was in the 1940s. And one must remember that the managers he was talking about were not largely college educated, except for the very elite. And in fact, only about 40% of the population had even finished secondary school, much less even began to discuss post-secondary school till after the GI Bill. Burnham did not see the specific form of management that emerged, nor could anyone imagine how much credentialing would spread throughout the economy as population rose and skilled labor became more specialized and semi-skilled labor became automated, and yet the fundamental driving of the economy did not change. And in fact, if anything, our hours of work expanded. No, we have to critique progress. Matt, Chris Lehman, and Sam, so that's Matt Stillman and Sam Adler-Bell, has said sometimes it is the Marxists who stand on top of history and say no. Sometimes it is the progressives and the leftists. Now, I don't want to be associated with progressives. I don't like its classical legacy, even without the eugenics. And I do not share Lasch's optimism about populism, but I think populism is at least something worth considering. Lasch himself, and it's Lasch's critiques of populism that have informed me through most of my life, have pointed out that the simple political economy and the simple cultural analysis of populism leads to conspiracy thinking, to blaming elites, to blaming outside groups. It degenerates into racism. That isn't all that's there. The question becomes, how can you deal with the truth of what the populist impulse is, the radical power egalitarianism, that we all have something to play in the creation of our world and our society? Versus the idea that the cultural notions and the political economic notions are simply one of the haves and have-nots, or of one middle group who interferes and helps the top against all others. Lasch saw the problem with this. But in a way, what he was critiquing was the smug self-satisfaction of a technocratic elite. We may call them the PMC, but that definition, as commonly thrown around, is too expansive. We are not talking about the 40% of the population who have attended college, university, or the 60% who have some post-secondary education, or the 90% now who have finished high school. No, we are not talking about that, even though these things have cultural importance too. And I agree with Jeff Smith, the author of The Undisciplined Mind, that there are values and social limitations that education places on people that an individual can break out of, but it takes active, conscious mechanisms to do. But that is not the problem. So the political economy has been changing to focus more and more on rents and less on investment. And even tangible consumer goods, which is what Lasch was describing in the 1970s, are not what drives our economy now. We're all seeking rents somehow. It is a rent-seeking economy. Even a fairly conservative economistic thinker like Tyler Cohen can see this for what it is. And he talks about this leading to secular stagnation, and he is not wrong. The focus on identities and self-reflection and representation is different than radical power egalitarianism. Now, you know, I limit what I say here. This is this impulse again that I have. Egalitarianism in abstract is almost meaningless because it would imply we are all the same. And we are not all the same. Not of ethnic background, not of physical capacity. All right? And the other way, and the only way we have made sameness so as to abstract it to the point that it is meaningless. This is Marx's point in the Critique of the Goethe program. The disabled may have advantages and disadvantages from the abled, the armless from the armed, the neurotypical from the neurodivergent. And they both may be valuable, but they are not the same and cannot be made equivalent. No, power egalitarianism is the radical proposal and the radical responsibility, and this part is often missed, that we are all capable of constructing our world and all responsible for it. One of the ironies of representative democracy is that it includes us to think that we are participating in our society when we are really just fanboys in a great stadium game. Now, if society works, right, and society, of course, is also a vagary, right, as is community. But if our way of reproducing ourselves works and people are striving, we don't think much about politics. In fact, depoliticization is normal. But we have to think about the perverse set of incentives this gives to representatives. I used to, myself, when I was a right-winger, and even as a long time as a left-winger, reject the idea of sortition and democratic input because I'd struggled out of the working class, and I knew that not everyone was able to, even if it wasn't their fault. All right? Learning takes time. I once had a long debate with Douglas Lane, I'll say the name here, about understanding philosophy. And I said, look, you have to read German. And he said, look, I shouldn't have to go to college. And we were fighting about it. And I said, no, you don't have to go to college, but you do have to do the work. The credential isn't the important thing. The work, the struggle, the knowledge, the reading is. One of the ironies of today, and this has even been encouraged by educational culture, is superficial readings so that we can show that we know something, or in with the latest fads, know the social and cultural capital without actually having done the work. We do not improve ourselves collectively or individually by preening, by virtue signaling. And just because right-wingers weaponize virtue signaling as a concept does not mean there is not legitimacy to the critique of it. Now, signaling virtue is actually useful. I will even say that. But it is not useful in and of itself. Lasch helps us here. Lasch points out our failure. You see, the subtitle of this video is The Scandal of the American Mind, and that is from The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. It's a book by Mark A. Knoll. Now, I'm not a Christian. I don't have Christian values, but I actually do think studying most of the religious traditions of the world is useful. Do I think there are always positive influences in the world? No. In fact, sometimes I agree with Freddie de Boer that they're malign influences. And I say this as a person who has religious inclinations, just of a different background. But these ideas came out of the same material circumstances that produced secular ones and should not be thrown away as nothing. There's a reason why humans have adopted them. They're not just parasitic mind viruses, like the original idea of memes spread around by new atheists in the mid-aughts suggested. Itself a fad, a meme, so to speak. In fact, if anything, the secularization of thought has led to the religious world being less different from the secular world, losing touch with its own knowledge and self-conception and its own history. Evangelicals are a losing force today, partly because they do not know people like Jonathan Edwards or Reinhold Niebuhr, or even someone like Sproul, but are stuck with apologists like Dinesh D'Souza and flatterers. and unserious people. And thus they are rife also with the inability to hold their flock accountable and for the flock to hold their leadership accountable. And thus the sex scandals that we used to associate just with the old hierarchical institutions like the Catholic Church are rife in evangelical circles too, but most less talked about. And the evangelicals do not seem to be able to generate their own legal or theological thinkers, and they leave this up to liturgical forms of Christianity. In fact, Orthodox thinkers fill the role, as well as Catholic ones. And on the bench, as I pointed out many times, most of the conservative jurists that we deal with are either high church Anglicans or Catholics. This is to say that Mark A. Knoll was right. The scandal of the evangelical mind is that it didn't have one. And he was a Protestant himself. Likewise, the scandal of the American mind is that over time, because of our hegemony, because of our dominance in society, we become lazy. And the world, even as we become less of an important variable in it, looks more and more like us in the way that it speaks and talks and asserts itself. This is neither good nor bad. It just is. And you see, this is where Lasch is useful. The assumption of progress makes you lazy. Makes you assume you don't need to know your past and you don't need to know your future. And because of that, you also don't actively participate in your present. Radical democratic impulses makes demands of comrades, not just flatters them. It treats you as an equal because it sees you as responsible as an equal. If every cook can govern, then every cook can be recalled. That is the radical message of power egalitarianism. But the limitations of Lasch are there as well. And what do I mean by that? I'm not comfortable entirely with the literalization of Freudianism Lasch does, nor do I think that is always necessarily justified. While it is helpful for him clarifying what he was talking about in his early books, from Haven in a Heartless World all the way back to liberalism and the Russian Revolution, one can start to see that this cultural focus is not truly a corrective to the populist impulse. While it is often true that Marxists and other kinds of radicals have made economism the answer to political determinism, by that, they deal with the voluntarism of politics making anything it wants to a kind of base determines everything. And by base, we mean productive capacity and productive forces. And by productive forces, we mean merely economics. Ignoring that even in Marx, relations of production, legal, formal, social relationships are part of the base. They define class roles as much as anything else. And in fact, one of the developments that is both interesting and useful about bourgeois society, but also deceptive, is that the legal and the power and the domination gets sublimated into exploitation. So what does this mean for you? Why am I ranting about Lasch, talking about complexity here, talking about the things I always talk about? Well, it means for you a couple of things, and one of them is actually hard to deal with. It means that you cannot assume that any existing political formation will operate for you without you engineering actively and collectively, it takes more than one person to do this, what it functions to do, because they are designed for the society we live in. And it produces certain results and has certain maladaptive effects. Right? Thinking about the right side of history and justice and identity and all this often is a distraction for what it would take to make us all have a say in our future. And we all deserve a say, whether we like the other person or not. And I don't just mean every man, every white man, I mean everybody. But that requires us to be critical. It requires us to hold each other to high standards. And it requires us to believe that anybody can meet those standards if given the opportunity. No, everyone can't meet everything. I don't believe, for example, everyone has to read every book I do, or that I could go be a basketball player tomorrow. There are limitations. We have skills and advantages. We are different. But we all should have equal say because of that difference. The liberal dependence on fairly elite development is not something we should think is good. I am tired, for one, of hearing people go on and defend college as if college was in and of itself an institution to define merit. I was in college for years, and it was a disillusioning experience for me because it wasn't meritocratic. Now, that doesn't mean it's completely not meritocratic. It's probably more meritocratic than most other institutions in our society until you look at its administrative overhead and the innovation of the state. And the fact that novelty, which is often useful for searching out new ideas and developing them, can also become a real limitation, a real problem. For actually developing things in a fair and just way that just rewards people who are good at certain skills or assets. And we've seen this in the fact that our society has become more and more educated as we become increasingly dysfunctional. But you don't just have to look at the United States. You can look at a country with an excellent education system, Russia, where it doesn't improve the lot of most people beyond a very limited sense. And that's because larger political factors and larger economic factors define things for good and ill. It's not because the Russian society is inherently better or worse than the United States. I don't believe in moral equivocating like that between societies. But what I will say, or moral hierarchizing like that, or equivocating, neither one of them. But what I will say is that it points out that education in and of itself will not fix everything. We can't all become coders, and anyone who understands supply and demand, even the most basic concept of neoclassical economics, can tell you that would not work. And yet we pretend it would work all the time. No. The reason why people are angry, the reason why there's a populist vote, the reason why there's right-wing reaction is that we have, as the left has largely been soft on liberal developments, even as critiquing them, because, well, it is apparent that we have thought we could use them in a new way, and we haven't been able to. The progressives have not been good for us, and they only resent us for our attempts to change them. I work with teachers, And every teaching job I've ever had, teaching is an interesting profession. Most of the people are lower middle class background or middle class in background. Some people are rich. Inevitably, I work with some rich liberal do-gooder who drives a BMW and goes to school. Often a man, actually, who does this and is married to some professional woman or comes from money. And they will always say things that seem like they care about the poor and care about social progress, but then they'll say stuff like, I don't understand why everyone can't just move to New York to get a job. That's a real quote, by the way. Or I don't understand what people have problems with Joe Biden during inflation. And I'm like, well, it's because it doesn't affect you very much. You're wearing $100 Nike shoes that you collect to a school. And these people often are also very smart. They're not cruel people. They're not dumb. But their assumptions that the people who come from a different background is endemic. And it's that resentment that's justified that leads a lot of people into reactionary politics. Because we've let them represent us. Because we have also tried to march with the academy. And here I mean the far left. And we pretended that was a good. Think about the female Panthers, the women Panthers, the male Panthers went to prison, the women Panthers went into academia or into exile in Cuba. Except that wasn't true, too. Many of the female Panthers went to prison. Think about Think about Tupac's mom. No, the Long March to the Institution ended up domesticating us, limiting us, tying us into the system, and tying us into the liberal end of the system because higher education is a liberalizing affair. Notice I did not say a leftizing affair. And it is tied to elites, even though it's often acts as kind of the backdoor conscious of elites, all right, in a way that has linked a lot of the left away from things that would help it. But there's also another tendency that we need to talk about. The tendency of the left, of the part of the left that sees itself as Marxist, at least in the democratic socialist or social democratic vein, that likes to flatter the workers, to say we're always on the verge of reunionizing, even though private unionization is between 7 and 8%. That we represent the working class, even though we define working class incoherently. That we tell the working class that it's doing well and that it's good and we should fight it, while ignoring the problems that are lumpenizing it, plaguing it, being deleterious, leading to addiction, incel behavior, reactionary impulses, etc. That is flattering them. That is flattering people just like the right does. But the right at least has the decency to make demands and we don't. Such a permissive, undemanding politics is often seen by people as unserious, and rightly so. Also, it seems to people as delusional and of educated outsiders pretending to be something they're not. I learned a long time ago that we shouldn't pretend we're all the same. I learned a long time ago that education matters, but credentialing doesn't. But I'm also from that class that we like to romanticize about, and I'm tired of hearing about how great we are. It is good to come from nowhere. It is good to know these things, I guess. But we must ask ourselves, in a real sense, are we just rendering the working class into some other outside noble savage to which we project our politics because we won't take the agency to build the world ourselves? Particularly when we start coming up with new ideas of class that make what working class even is harder and harder to tell. Are we talking about blue-collar manufacturing workers? Are we talking about just workers without education? Are we talking about anyone with wages? We often move between these concepts without even denoting we do, like drunken Protestants talking about God. Drunken anybody talking about God, frankly. No. We should understand that there are tensions between workers, groups of workers. We should understand that doesn't mean they're not working class. We should understand that the precarious and impoverishing elements throughout society do not do good for you. They are deleterious to you. Maybe so is extreme wealth. In fact, I'm almost certain that it is. I hate to have a Goldilocks theory of what is good and true in regards to the way class works, but maybe that is the case. As an anecdote, I've taught the very, very rich in the world and the very poor, and often their children have the same pathologies: drug addiction, alienation, loneliness, porn addiction, etc. And this is not because I'm a moralizer. I don't think that any of the things I just listed are necessarily inherently bad, but they're not inherently good either. In a lonely situation, they're usually deleterious. This is what Lasch is useful for. It is not just that we have to meet people where they are. We have to understand why they are where they are and what good they see and how it may be abused by others. We have to empower them and empower ourselves by understanding these frames of thought, and not with these superficial, self-flattering ways we often engage things now. This is not to say that narcissism is necessarily the right way to talk about this. Natalie from Superstructure chastised me on Twitter for putting Kim Kardashian on the cover of a speech I did about cultural narcissism. Well, I didn't do that. I was on One Dime's channel, and One Dime's cool, but I don't use Kardashians or celebrity culture to talk about cultural narcissism, because I think that's a very small part of what Lasch is talking about, and I think there are other things tied into that, including sexism, that make it problematic to use Kardashians as the representation of that. There are plenty of men who are famous just for being famous too. I think it misses the point. And so I grant what Natalie said is a legitimate criticism of what happened. And that's why I don't love talking about this in terms of narcissism. Also, Lasch's social narcissism has pretty much remained unique to him. It has not been picked up, has not become a largely developed analytical tradition of which we can really apply. But there are key ideas that we need to focus on. The way self becomes propelled by anxiety, and the way anxiety drives consumerism, and the way consumerism now drives brand formation, identity formation, and rents down to the personal and individual level. And that leads to all kinds of perverse incentives. Watch how streamer politics get weird over time as they become personalities. Watch how people become trolls. Watch how people get addicted to following the various culture comp things on Twitter, many of which have no effect on anything. And I am just as prone to it as anyone else. Believe me, I like making fun of people making fun of problematic philosophers and historians, because it's kind of funny. Because almost everyone's problematic, including, non-Western, non-white, non-male philosophers, etc. Because history is complicated and doesn't follow unilateral moral notions of human development. It is far more stochastic than that. And even when it is not stochastic, when it is actually teleological, because we are actually building things, there are always unforeseen developments, weird growths, and strange path dependencies that we need to deal with. There is no end of history, even if we were beyond nation states. So Lasch's limitations is in this as well, but it is quite useful. Now I'm going to do a lot more on Christopher Lasch, because I'm writing a book on him, for one thing, with Shall on Time. And I want people to know I get a lot of credit, but it's not just me who's writing this book. My co-author is a brilliant but shy academic who does not want to be foisted into the public eye. Doesn't even know she wants to be an academic. Probably shouldn't say that. But it's a legitimate fear. I also deal with it. I, in many ways, have used this to rebuild the world that I thought academia was. All right. That's what social media failed to do for me. And that's what podcasting and video casting started to kind of do for me. The development of a salon culture that opened people from all sides. And even though if people didn't understand what I was saying, and even if some of the comments were obnoxious and silly, and even if some of the movements were quite dumb, it was at least productive even when it was failing. That's what I mean. But my radical democratic impulse is that we should demand people to be better. But we have to know what better is and can't just assume it's happening. The reason why people are mad, the reason why flyover country is mad, the reason why real America is mad, right? No, there is no real America. Everyone in America is real America, in so much as there's anything to such a broad concept being real. But the resentment and the cultural battle there is both sides want to be represented and both sides feel left out. From the Wallacean systems theory point of view, a lot of flyover country has been used as an internal colony, both racially and non-racially, for the entirety of the last 2 centuries. And then to be shamed that these people were, that these areas were taking money for the military that was actually propping up those imperial core places like California, New York, really rub people's craw in ways they can't articulate, but can understand why they feel that way, but not exactly how it works. The number of people, even who talk about the smug self-satisfaction of liberals, who will still shame people who aren't from civilization, i.e. New York or California, and their urban cores, is a little bit astounding. The world has not been good for a lot of the internal periphery of the United States. And the people shaming it that it's losing its privilege still have their privilege, even enough to give it away. No. There's a reason why that part of the country is mad. It's not because it's the real America. Both part of the real America. The real America is ugly, like any hegemon is ugly into itself. It does not want to recognize itself in the parts of itself it doesn't want to see. After all, these flyover countries have their thuggish elites too, and they're often the conservative politicians they're kowtowing to and their families. These politicians having none of the virtues even ascribed to the petty bourgeoisie, much less to the working class. No. But to move beyond this, we have to move beyond flattery. We have to think clearly. We have to think progress for what, defined what, and how. Generic progress is useless. It's not real. It's not even wrong. Now, I'm going to do a series on the Vienna Circle like I started to do with the Frankfurt School. I'm probably going to, back when I did Theorizing with a Hammer, probably going to do the Frankfurt School 2 again in a more thorough way because I never finished that. Gene Baudrillard and I are working on a series on the concept of nationalism, both contemporary debates. But I keep on telling Gene we also need to talk about the socialist history, because it has a particular history in socialism that's not easy to reconcile. This has been the specialty of other people. But I'm going to be talking about a lot of different things. Most of you need to diversify what you're taking in, how you're processing it, not because you need to know both sides or some idiocy like that. No, you need to be able to think in different ways, to put on different mindsets so that you can win the one you value. And so you can understand why people believe what they believe. Both why they justify it and how they justify it and how they actually arrive there. Because those are often very different things, right? Anyway, with that, good night and good luck.